So the next part of the talk, I want to move to null models. And null models are crucial in connectomics to set references, to set benchmarks. And I want to begin with this example. So this is a small network, and I want to consider the network measure of path length. We'll see this again in one of the subsequent sessions of this workshop. So in this small network, the average path length is 2. So this means to get between any pair of nodes, we need to traverse 2 connections, as I've shown here for the particular example. And so the question is this, if you map a connectome and you find that the average path length is 2, is this long, is it short, or is it typical? We don't know. It's hard to determine just based on a measure of path length how to interpret that. And so we need some kind of benchmark. The simplest benchmark is to compute path length in a random network with the same number of nodes and edges. So there's a closed form formula to do that. We can plug in the number of nodes, 9, and the number of edges, which is 15. And we find that for a random network, the average path length is also 2. So this suggests that for this particular network, there's nothing unusual. There's nothing that's particularly conducive to efficient routing of paths. The path length is actually exactly the same as what we would expect in a random network. Let's now move on to this network. This is a bigger network. This is a lattice network. And we see that the average path length is 2.5. So we have to traverse 2.5 connections to get between any pair of nodes. And we ask the same question, is 2.5 long, is it short, or is it average? And so we can once again benchmark to an average network. We plug in the number of nodes, the number of edges, being 20 and 40 into this formula. And we see that the average path length for a network with 20 nodes and 40 connections is 2. It's actually shorter. So what we can say is that a lattice is not particularly conducive to efficient routing, to efficient shortest paths. There's something specific about this topology that makes it not efficient for routing. And this is a well-known fact about lattice networks. So in this example, the null network, the reference network, is the random network that's matched in the number of nodes and edges. But you might think, well, what other things might we want to match? Do we really just want to match the nodes and the edges? We might need to match the node degree, the connection length, and so on and so forth. So we can consider a nested family of null networks. And so in the outermost circle, we have the space of all possible networks. And this is probably not a very useful null network. And in the innermost circle, we say we want to match the number of nodes to our actual connectome. Then we say we want to match not only the number of nodes, but also the number of nodes and edges. And this is exactly what we did in the previous example, where we had the closed form formula that gave us the path length for a random network with the same number of nodes and the same number of edges as our actual network, as our actual connectome. But we can go further. We can also not only match the number of nodes and edges, we can also map node degree. And this is perhaps the most common type of null network in connectomics. That's the green family of null networks. And more recently, there has been endeavors to also match the geometry of the connectome. And this gives us the innermost circle here. So we're gradually adding more and richer properties to our null, which confines the null more and more. Of course, if we add too many, if we keep adding properties, we're eventually going to converge to our real network, to our actual connectome. So how do we actually do inference with these kind of null networks? A common approach is that we sample null networks from this null space. So in here, I've shown the most common family of nulls, where we match the number of nodes, number of edges, and the node degree. And the purple crosses here represent random networks that match these 3 properties. So we can generate tens, 20, hundreds of random networks as such. We can compute path length in each of these networks, and then we can divide that by the actual path length in our real connectome. And so if this ratio is 1, it says that our actual connectome, the path length is not particularly unusual. In contrast, if it's greater than 1, it suggests that our path length is exceptionally long relative to a random network that's matched in terms of these 3 properties. We can also compute p-values to assess the same hypothesis. So you might ask, how do we actually generate random networks? How do we sample networks that preserve the number of edges, the number of nodes, and the node degree? And we can do this very efficiently with the Maslov-Snepen rewiring algorithm. This involves taking our connectome, we identify 4 nodes that are connected in the pattern shown here. So U is connected to V and I to J. And we then rewire them such that U then connects to I and V connects to J. And we repeat this step again and again. So we keep finding 4 node motifs, such as the one shown here, and rewiring them as such until we reach an adequate level of randomization in our network. And this gives us one sample from that null space. And we can do that again. And so we can generate a family of null networks. And we can compute our network measure in each member of that family. And this enables us to build up an empirical null distribution. It is a little more difficult to do this for unthresholded weighted networks, but check out the work of Rubinov and Sporns for some extensions of Maslov-Snepen rewiring in those cases. So here's some examples of Maslov-Snepen applied to real-world networks, to a macaque and a mouse connectome. There's a sample of the Maslov-Snepen network that's shown here on the right for both of those connectomes. In practice, we generate hundreds of such samples. And here we're showing the normalized clustering and path length. So you see that the normalized clustering is greater than 1 relative to, so this is what we've normalized by the Maslov-Snepen rewire. So it suggests that the connectome is clustered to a greater extent than what we would expect in a random network. In contrast, the path length is exactly 1. The normalized path length is 1. So it's saying that the path length is what we'd expect in a random network. And small worldness is greater than 1. So these are small world connectome to small world networks, which is a well-established fact. More recently, there has been interest in incorporating geometry into our null networks in connectomics. And this allows us to assess the impact of geometry on network topology. So Roberts and colleagues have developed an efficient approach to preserve geometry in our null networks. Basically involves regress. So geometry is contextualized in terms of fiber length, the distance, the physical distance between pairs of regions. And the first step is to regress out this fiber length. We then shuffle the connections and then basically add the geometry back into the shuffle connections. And this generates a realization, a sample from the null network. So what we see here is once we add geometry back into our null network, if you focus on the plot here on the bottom, which is clustering coefficient, this is the blue curve, the blue line is the clustering coefficient for the real connectome. The red here is for the non-geometry preserving, in other words, Maslov-Snepen rewiring, and there's quite a big gap between the real connectome and the red line. In contrast, once we add geometry back into our null model, we see that the clustering coefficient, it becomes closer to what it is in our real connectome. So this suggests that geometry is influencing, at least to a certain extent, network topology, in this case called the clustering coefficient. There is an alternative or a related concept in null models called generative models, and this is an idea where we grow networks in silico according to particular wiring rules. The idea is that we grow the networks and then compare them to the empirical connectomes to see how well they match. So Petrovertis has considered 3 different models. There's a geometric component to the model, and then there's a topological component. The best fitting model was the one that's shown on the bottom here, the economical clustering. So Pij represents the probability of forming a connection between a pair of nodes. So the best model was that we encourage connections between pairs of nodes that are close to each other, that are physically close to each other, and also that share common neighbors. And this is a property referred to as homophily. Rick Betzel also generalized this model to include other topological rules. Once again, the best fitting model was one that included a geometric constraint, promoting connections between pairs of nodes that are close to each other, and also a homophily constraint. So in other words, encouraging connections between pairs of nodes that share the same neighbors. So in summary, I've shown that null models can set expectations for network organization under certain null hypotheses. The most common null network involves preservation of the number of nodes, the number of edges, and node degree. And this can be efficiently realized with the Maslov-Snepen rewiring algorithm. In recent times, there's been interest in also preserving not only the edges, nodes, and the node degree, but also the geometry of the connectome. This is often contextualized in terms of fiber length, connection length, in other words. And I've also covered the related concept of generative models and shown that both geometry and homophily play a key role in evolving connectomes in silico. So if you're interested, the VCT functions for Maslov-Snepen rewiring and generative modeling are provided on the bottom.